Can the group's credit rating be used in transfer pricing? Intercompany loans and interest rates. How do you determine the right interest rate for a loan between companies in the same multinational group? At first glance, it sounds simple, but in practice, every rate reflects a complex assessment of credit risk and the arm's length principle. In transfer pricing, the starting point is always the same. What level of risk is the lender taking? And how should that risk be reflected in the interest rate? Normally, that risk is measured through an individual credit rating. However, in most cases, the entity doesn't have its own rating, only the group's rating. In these situations, the OECD Transfer Pricing Guidelines, under Chapter 10, acknowledges that when a reliable standalone rating isn't available, for example, because a third party doesn't have access to all the group's financial information, the group's credit rating can be used as reference. The OECD guidelines even note that this approach can be more practical than estimating a credit rating from scratch. But this practical solution also brings a conceptual problem. Financial theory teaches us that a group's overall risk is not simply the sum of the risks of its subsidiaries. It would only be equal if all companies were perfectly correlated, which almost never happens in reality. In practice, subsidiaries operate in different countries, sectors, and currencies, creating diversification that lowers the group's consolidated risk below the weighted average of its parts. This means the group appears more stable and less risky than any one entity on its own. That diversification benefit exists precisely because the entities are related parties, and this is where transfer pricing comes in. The arm's length principle seeks to replicate conditions that would exist between independent parties. An external lender doesn't have access to the group's internal diversification, nor does it benefit from it. Therefore, using the group's credit rating for a single entity effectively reflects a lower level of risk than what an independent lender would actually assume. The result is clear. By applying the group's credit rating, the borrower's credit risk is underestimated. And when risk is underestimated, the resulting interest rate can be artificially low, failing to reflect what a third-party lender would demand. In other words, using the group's credit rating directly can distort the transfer pricing analysis, moving the transaction away from the arm's length standard. At QCG Transfer Pricing, we help multinational groups define intercompany interest rates that reflect their true credit risk and comply with the arm's length principle. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, you'll find the full article linked in the description below. Visit QCGTransferPricing.com and discover how to transform transfer pricing into a strategic advantage.